Summary of The Fire Next Time by James Baldwin. The first part of The Fire Next Time is a short letter to Baldwin's 14-year-old nephew, James, about the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation 100th anniversary. Baldwin tells James that when he thinks of the boy's face, he sees his brother's face, James's father, and his own father's face, James's grandpa. He says that James's grandfather had the same kind of strong-willed, outspoken attitude as the boy. Baldwin thinks that this is a way to avoid looking weak or soft. After making this connection, Baldwin tells James that his grandfather was killed by his belief that he was what white society said he was, a lower-class person. Because of this, the man turned to religion. Baldwin says that James is not religious, but instead represents a new time and way of thought. He tells his nephew not to make the same mistake as his grandpa and believe what white people say about James. Baldwin's advice to his nephew has a lot to do with the past, both in terms of their family history and the wrongs that have been done in America in the past. He tells young James that they were both born into a country that is set up against them. From the moment they are born, they are set up to suffer under white domination. Before this point, it's important to note that Baldwin only calls white Americans James' countrymen. He says that these people are innocent, by which he means, for the most part, ignorant, and that their innocence, or more correctly, their mistaken belief that they are innocent, keeps them from recognizing the presence of African Americans. And even when this fact is acknowledged, it is only to show that black people are useless. Baldwin knows that this is a hard thing to tell his nephew in such a direct way, but he says that James can gain strength and freedom from knowing where he came from. This means he has to realize that the ugly ideas people try to push on him don't come from a real sense of being less than, but from the sad fear of his white peers. Baldwin tells his nephew James that he should not waste his time trying to get white people to accept him because this is not important. Instead, he should find a way to accept them. This is because they don't know much about history and are stuck in a past they don't understand. The only way to change the awful race mindset in the US, which automatically puts black people down, is to teach white people about the country's troubled past and the terrible things they did to make it that way. Baldwin makes it clear that these people won't be able to understand themselves or their fellow black people until they do. At the end of this letter, Baldwin talks about the word integration. He says that the only way to get white people to see themselves as they are and start working to change the structures of inequality that have been built into the United States, or, in other words, to start the process of true racial integration, is for black people to show white people acceptance and love. Baldwin says that the country is enjoying freedom 100 years too soon on the 100th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation. He also says that for African Americans to be free, white Americans must also be free. In the next piece, Down at the Cross, Baldwin talks about a rough time in his life when he was 14 and starting to understand what it was like to grow up as an African American in Harlem. During that summer, he watched as many of his friends turned to crime. For the first time, he realized that the pimps, whores, and drug users he saw on the streets were examples of what he could easily become. He realized that these people, who he had always thought were different from him, were all from the same place he was. He got active in church life to stay away from the bad things on the streets and the bad things he suddenly thought he could do. Baldwin saw his friends going out into the dangerous street, and he also began to realize that the boys around him would never be as successful or as well off as their dads. His own father tried to get him to quit school and get a job, but Baldwin said no. This was more of a way to show he didn't care about education than a belief in education. Baldwin's father once asked one of his friends if he was saved. When Baldwin told his father that the boy was Jewish, Baldwin's father hit him hard across the face. Baldwin told his father that his friend was a better Christian in the end than he was. Baldwin sees this encounter as a time when he and his father both realized that they were fighting against each other. His father was the authority figure, and Baldwin was the one who was fighting back. Baldwin says that all African American boys around this age look for a gimmick, or something to keep them busy and invest in, as a way to deal with the fears that a racist society has taught them. As a 14-year-old, Baldwin was becoming aware of the race differences he had to deal with. He was also becoming aware of the different kinds of power over him, including his father's. His gimmick was to join a church that wasn't the one where his father taught. This helped him deal with his fears of living a meaningless life on the streets and pushed back against his father's power over him. Now that he is an adult, he realizes that when he joined the church, he basically switched one person in charge for another. When his friend brought him to church for the first time, the minister looked at him and asked, "Whose little boy are you?" This was the same question that pimps and other crooks on the street used to ask him. Baldwin's book The Fire Next Time gives the real answer to this question: why yours? Baldwin was looking for someone to take charge of him and show him the way. He was a teenager with a lot of questions, and it was hard for him to understand the race problems that were holding him back. Even though he finally found that religion was just as full of false dreams as other gimmicks, he is thankful that he found the church during this dangerous time instead of something riskier and more dangerous. Still, Baldwin became less trusting of faith over time, which he explains by talking about the past of the Christian church. Christianity was built on sharing the good news, but it took a lot of power over other people for that to happen. Baldwin says that, since Christianity has been so important to empire, anyone who wants to live a decent life should rethink the basic ideas of Christianity. This look at the Christian church leads to a look at the Nation of Islam, which is a black separatist movement that uses parts of the Islamic religion to promote and put black safety and wealth first. Baldwin talks about what the Nation of Islam believes and about its head, Elijah Muhammad, who once had Baldwin over to his Chicago home. Members of the NOI say that black people once ran the whole world. This didn't change until the devil himself made white people, and even then, Allah only let the white devils rule for a short time, which, at the time Baldwin wrote his book, was meant to be coming to an end. Baldwin wasn't sure during his meeting with Elijah and a bunch of other NOI followers that he should believe in a forecast that favors African Americans over white Americans. Baldwin says that power is the NOI's main concern above all else because that's what most of the talk at Elijah's house was about. Baldwin thinks that the idea that all white people are cursed, are devils, and are about to be brought down is similar to the kind of divided ideas put forward by Christianity, which he has already shown to be deeply cruel and wrong. Even though he doesn't agree, Baldwin spends a lot of time making it clear that he knows and maybe even sympathizes with how someone could come to think this way after generations of being mistreated by white people. He says that there is no real reason why black people should be expected to deal with the country's racial problem with more ease, patience, and goodwill than white people. Baldwin urges Americans not to respond to white injustice by proposing similar, but opposite, segregationist solutions. Instead, he says, they should look at history and try to accept it, no matter how hard it is to deal with such a tense and troubled past. He shows this by telling a story about a talk he had with one of Elijah's group, a man who drove him to his destination after dinner at the NOI's offices. During the drive, Baldwin asked the young man how the NOI planned to take the land they thought belonged to them in America. Baldwin asked the driver to prove that the NOI was powerful and that their claims were true. In response, the driver told Baldwin that African Americans are responsible for $20 billion a year in the American economy. This number, he said, shows the strength of the NOI's cause. Baldwin responds to this way of thinking by pointing out that this large amount of money is part of the American economy as a whole. If black Americans were cut off from the rest of the country's markets, they would lose a lot of their power. At this point, Baldwin is trying to show the driver that for the goal of separate freedom to come true, the entire frame of reference that the original wish is based on would have to change a lot. Even though he didn't push the driver any further, Baldwin goes on in the essay to say that in order to change a situation, you have to recognize and even accept the present situation and the history that led to it. In this case, it's best to understand that you can't just propose a new race reality. Instead, you have to make change from what you already know, no matter how hard it seems. At this point, Baldwin starts to think about segregation, which was a big issue in the early 1960s. He says that the 1954 Supreme Court decision to ban racial segregation in public schools was less a sign of progress, as white liberals were quick to say, and more of a competitive and defensive move in the Cold War. Russia was trying to spread communism, so the US needed the support and help of African countries. However, it would be hard to get their support if racism and mistreatment of black people were put into the country's laws. Baldwin says that this is why the end of racism was a call to Africa in the fight against the USSR as a whole. This shows that the only time freedom or equality has been given up in the US is when it helps the white power structure. This is a sad fact of life in the US. Sad to say, the United States has been in a better position than any other Western country to show that the idea of color is useless and outdated, but it hasn't dared to take advantage of this chance or even think of it as one. In fact, Baldwin's analysis of America's fake growth shows that the country isn't ready to look at itself honestly. Baldwin says that love is the answer, even though it might sound too romantic. At the very least, white people in America need to learn to love themselves, which means they need to learn to accept how different they are. And Baldwin tells African Americans to keep doing what they have done for generations, not giving in to hate. White people need black people for a good country, and black people need white people. He says that this is the only way for a group to be strong. Baldwin ends his speech with a word warning, using a Bible-based slave spiritual as a metaphor, that if Americans don't work together, there will be destruction and fire.
About the author. James Baldwin was born in Harlem in 1924. He was the oldest of 9 children and the grandson of a slave. Even though his real father wasn't there, the young author's stepfather was soon a Baptist preacher called David Baldwin. Baldwin's relationship with David would change over the years, but it would also shape him. Baldwin's experience as a youth minister in an opposite church was both a response to and a rejection of his Baptist preacher's stepfather's example. Baldwin said that his time in the church, where he had to prepare and give several sermons a week, was an important part of his growth as a writer because it pushed him to think about a wide range of human feelings. In his most famous book, Go Tell It on the Mountain, and in his play, The Amen Corner, he talks about these things. After he graduated from high school, Baldwin spent most of his time as a book reviewer in Greenwich Village, which was a hub of imagination and forward thinking at the time. Around this time, the famous author Richard Wright saw Baldwin's ability and helped him get a grant so he could work on a book and make money while he did it. Baldwin went to Paris in 1948 to get away from America both physically and mentally so he could write more clearly about his home country. The result was the book Go Tell It on the Mountain, which he put out in 1953. Baldwin moved back to the United States in 1957. When he did, he joined the civil rights movement. This was the start of his well-known career as an outspoken agitator and socially aware public thinker who fought for calm answers to race tensions in America. Baldwin spent the last 10 years of his life working in France. In the wake of the deaths of civil rights worker Medgar Evers and civil rights leader Martin Luther King, Jr., he wrote a number of important works about American identity. In 1987, he died in St. Paul, Delaware, France, of stomach cancer.
Hope we summarized it fully and you liked it. Please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel so that we are motivated to create more videos.